The first time people in my neighborhood saw Melissa Crane screaming in the middle of my front yard, soaked from head to toe while her expensive white sneakers disappeared into the mud, they thought my sprinkler system had finally gone crazy. I just stood on my porch with a mug of coffee, watching the water sparkle in the morning sun, and if I'm being completely honest, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. The funny thing is, everyone called it an accident. It wasn't. It was the first, perfectly legal consequence in a story that had been building for months. Long before anyone realized our quiet little subdivision wasn't fighting over grass at all, it was fighting over respect. My name is Ethan Brooks, and if you'd asked my neighbors a year earlier who I was, most would have shrugged and said, "That's the engineer with the nice lawn." That would have been accurate enough. I worked from home designing automation systems for commercial buildings, the kind of work that made me appreciate predictable patterns, quiet mornings, and things that behaved exactly the way they were designed to. My front yard reflected that mindset. Every flower bed had a purpose. Every stone lined up with the next. Every sprinkler head had been installed by my own hands after weeks of planning. It wasn't about showing off. It was my way of clearing my head after stressful projects. Some people golf. I grew grass. Then, Melissa moved into the neighborhood. She wasn't the HOA president at first, but you'd never know it by the way she acted. She had this confidence that made every conversation sound like an order, and every opinion somehow became everyone else's problem. Within 6 months, she'd won the election because she promised cleaner streets, higher property values, and bringing standards back. Most people clapped. I didn't vote against her because I thought she'd become a tyrant. I voted against her because I'd met enough people like her to know they confused authority with ownership. At first, our interactions were harmless. She'd stop while walking her golden retriever and comment on my landscaping. "Beautiful lawn," she'd say with a smile that never reached her eyes. "You should trim those hedges another inch. It'll look more uniform." I'd laugh politely and say I'd think about it. Then the comments became instructions. Then the instructions became criticisms. Then somehow my yard became part of her daily routine. My corner lot sat between the neighborhood entrance and the community mailbox. And instead of using the sidewalk like everyone else, Melissa decided cutting across my lawn saved her 30 seconds every morning. 30 seconds for her meant muddy footprints to fresh fertilizer for me. Her dog followed the same path every day, stopping in exactly the same place beside my rose bushes. I tried the normal approach first. "Hey, Melissa," I called one morning as she crossed the grass. "Would you mind sticking to the sidewalk? I just reseeded this section." She looked down at the lawn, then back at me with the kind of smile people wear when they're already planning how to dismiss you. "Oh, Ethan, it's just grass. Besides, we're all part of the same community." She kept walking. The next week, I installed small decorative edging around the flower beds. Nothing aggressive, just enough to encourage people toward the paved walkway. 2 days later, I found half of it kicked over. Melissa claimed she'd tripped because it was a safety hazard. Somehow the broken edging became my fault. Then, I placed a tasteful little sign that read, "Please respect the lawn." It disappeared before sunset. A teenager across the street later admitted he'd watched Melissa pull it out while laughing with another board member. I could have confronted her, but I didn't. That's the thing about people like Melissa. They expect anger because anger gives them something to point at. I wasn't interested in giving her ammunition. Instead, I started paying attention. Every morning at exactly 8:10 at 17, she crossed the same strip of grass. Every afternoon around 5:40, she did it again while talking loudly on her phone. Every Saturday, she cut diagonally across the yard after HOA inspections, almost like she wanted me to remember who she thought was in charge. My neighbor Carlos noticed it too. One evening, while we were both dragging our trash bins to the curb, he shook his head and said, "She's doing it because you asked her not to." That sentence stayed with me longer than I expected because deep down I knew he was right. This had stopped being about convenience weeks ago. It had become a game, one where every footprint said, "I can do whatever I want." Around the same time, violation letters started appearing in my mailbox. My mailbox post was supposedly the wrong shade of black. My recycling bin had been visible for 2 extra hours after pickup. One letter even claimed my native wildflowers looked unmaintained. Every citation carried Melissa's signature. Every fine could be appealed to Melissa. I attended one HOA meeting hoping common sense might still exist. Instead, she smiled across the room and said, "Rules only work when everyone follows them equally." I almost laughed. This was the same woman who treated my property like a public park. As the meeting ended, An elderly neighbor quietly caught up with me in the parking lot. "Don't take it personally," she whispered. "She always picks someone." I watched Melissa climb into her SUV surrounded by people pretending to agree with everything she said. And for the first time I realized this wasn't really about me either. Bullies don't need reasons. They need targets. I drove home that night, looked across my perfectly maintained yard, and made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to argue anymore. I wasn't going to yell, threaten, or beg. If Melissa wanted to keep treating my lawn like her personal shortcut, then I was going to let my engineering background solve the problem in a way she would never see coming. And by the time she finally understood what had changed, the entire neighborhood would already be watching. The next Monday morning, I got up earlier than usual, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to enjoy my coffee before the neighborhood woke up. My sprinkler controller had been upgraded over the weekend with a few features I'd been meaning to install anyway. Motion sensors covered only my property. Every watering zone followed local conservation rules, and each activation was logged down to the second. Nothing illegal, nothing hidden, just a smarter version of the same irrigation system I'd already owned. At exactly 8:16, I saw Melissa appear at the end of the sidewalk with her golden retriever tugging happily on the leash. She glanced toward the paved path, then, just like every other morning, stepped onto my lawn without even looking at my front door. One more step, then another, and the sensors quietly confirmed what they had detected. Half a second later, the first sprinkler head rose from the ground. The water hit the morning sunlight before it hit Melissa. She let out a scream that echoed across the entire street, jumped backward, slipped in the wet grass, and landed sitting in the mud while her dog bolted toward the sidewalk. Curtains opened all over the neighborhood. A delivery driver stopped his truck. Even Carlos nearly dropped his garbage can laughing before he caught himself. Melissa stood up soaked, pointed at me with both hands, and shouted, "You did this on purpose." I took another sip of coffee and answered with the calmest voice I could manage. "No, Melissa. My sprinkler system watered my lawn. You just happened to be standing on it." That sentence somehow made her even angrier. Within an hour, she had filed a complaint with the HOA claiming I'd created a dangerous condition intended to harass a board member. 2 days later, I received another violation notice, this time accusing me of installing an unapproved landscape automation system. I almost admired the creativity. She couldn't complain that my grass was being watered, so now she was complaining that it was being watered intelligently. I called the county building office just to make sure I hadn't overlooked anything. The inspector laughed after reviewing my permit history. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "your irrigation system exceeds the county requirements. Whoever filed this complaint wasted everyone's time." I thanked him, saved the email, and moved on with my day. Melissa didn't. Instead, she doubled down. Every week another citation appeared. My porch light was allegedly too bright. My decorative stone supposedly violated community aesthetics. She even claimed my bird feeder attracted wildlife that threatened neighborhood safety. At first I wondered whether anyone actually believed her, but then small conversations started happening. Mrs. Donnelly from 3 houses over apologized for never speaking up when Melissa embarrassed me during HOA meetings. Carlos admitted he'd been fined over the color of his mailbox the year before. A retired firefighter named Bill confessed he'd spent nearly $2,000 replacing perfectly good fencing because Melissa insisted it wasn't compliant, only to discover months later there had never been such a rule. Once people realized they weren't the only target, something shifted. They stopped whispering privately and started comparing letters. One Saturday afternoon, 6 of us ended up standing in my driveway with stacks of violation notices spread across the hood of my truck like detectives examining evidence. The dates overlapped. The wording repeated itself. Entire paragraphs had obviously been copied and pasted. Bill looked at the paperwork and muttered, "She isn't enforcing rules. She's manufacturing control." That sentence changed the direction of everything. Until then, I'd been focused on protecting my yard. Now I started wondering what else Melissa had been doing while everyone was too intimidated to question her. Public HOA records weren't difficult to access if you knew where to look. Financial statements, meeting minutes, vendor contracts, they all told stories. Most people never read them because they assumed someone else already had. I spent several evenings going through years of documents with the same patience I normally use debugging complicated software. Patterns began appearing. Landscaping contracts kept being renewed without competitive bids. Meeting minutes referenced votes that never appeared on attendance sheets. Expenses were approved during meetings that several neighbors later swore had been canceled. None of it automatically proved fraud, but it certainly raised questions. Then something much stranger happened. I noticed invoices from a landscaping company owned by Melissa's brother-in-law. Every renewal increased in price while the quality of maintenance around the neighborhood visibly declined. I didn't jump to conclusions. Engineers learn early that assumptions are expensive. Instead, I organized everything into folders, highlighted discrepancies, and asked the HOA treasurer for clarification. 3 days later, he knocked on my front door after dark. His shoulders were tense, and he looked over both directions before speaking. "I shouldn't even be here," he whispered. "I've tried asking the same questions. Every time I do, Melissa says I'm slowing down progress." He handed me copies of several emails before leaving almost immediately. Reading them felt like opening a window into another world. Board members who disagreed with Melissa were ignored. Meetings were rescheduled without proper notice, and decisions were announced before votes ever happened. It wasn't a dictatorship, but it was drifting dangerously close. Meanwhile, Melissa remained obsessed with my lawn. She started walking around the edge of the property just to photograph it. She measured my hedges with a tape measure one afternoon, while talking loudly enough for me to hear every word. "Some people think expensive grass makes them smarter," she announced to nobody in particular. I kept trimming my roses. She wanted confrontation. Silence frustrated her far more than arguments ever could. Then came the mistake she couldn't undo. I was inside finishing a conference call when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the security cameras. Melissa had opened my side gate and walked directly into my backyard carrying a clipboard. At first, I assumed she'd immediately realize she was trespassing and leave. Instead, she crouched beside one of the irrigation control boxes, pulled out a screwdriver, and started removing the protective cover. My cameras captured everything in crystal clear resolution. She disconnected wiring, took photographs, and even muttered to herself that she'd finally found evidence of tampering. She never noticed the second camera mounted beneath the deck. By the time I walked outside, she had already reassembled the box and was heading toward the gate. She froze when she saw me. "Routine HOA inspection," she said confidently. I looked at the locked gate she'd entered through and asked, "Really? Since when does the HOA inspect private backyards without permission?" She hesitated for just a second before recovering. "Community compliance requires access when necessary." "That's interesting," I replied. "Would you mind explaining that to the police if they ask?" Her face changed immediately. For the first time since we'd met, genuine uncertainty replaced that practiced confidence. She left without another word. I didn't call the police that afternoon. Instead, I called an attorney the next morning, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted every next step handled correctly. My lawyer watched the footage twice before leaning back in his chair. "Ethan," he said quietly, "this stopped being about sprinklers a long time ago." I nodded because I'd finally accepted the same truth. Melissa thought she was fighting a homeowner over a patch of grass. She had no idea she was about to defend every decision she'd made since becoming HOA president. And unlike rumors or neighborhood gossip, security footage and financial records don't get emotional. They simply tell the truth. 2 weeks later, the clubhouse parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Word had spread that the monthly HOA meeting was going to be different, although nobody seemed to know exactly why. Melissa walked in wearing the same polished smile she'd worn since the day she became president, greeting people like nothing had changed. She still believed she controlled the room. She still thought I was just another homeowner she could wear down with paperwork and intimidation. My attorney arrived a few minutes before the meeting started carrying a slim binder that looked almost disappointingly ordinary. That's the thing about real evidence. It doesn't need to be dramatic. It only needs to be true. When the agenda reached homeowner comments, I stood up and calmly requested that several items be added to the discussion before the annual budget vote. Melissa rolled her eyes. "Mr. Brooks, if this is about your sprinkler system again, we've already heard enough." I smiled for what felt like the first genuine time in months. "Actually, this isn't about my sprinkler system anymore." My attorney connected a laptop to the projector mounted on the clubhouse wall. The first video showed Melissa walking through my locked side gate. The second showed her removing the irrigation control cover. The third displayed a timestamp proving she remained on my property for nearly 12 minutes without permission. The room became so quiet I could hear the projector fan humming overhead. Melissa immediately stood up. "Those videos don't show the entire situation." My attorney nodded politely. "You're right. which is why we'd also like everyone to see the property survey, the gate lock records, and the county regulations confirming the HOA has no authority to enter private backyards without homeowner consent. One document after another appeared on the screen. Then came the financial records. Renew all contracts awarded to the same landscaping company year after year. Meeting minutes that conflicted with attendance logs. Budget approvals that lacked the required board votes. I wasn't accusing anyone of crimes because that wasn't my job. I was simply asking questions supported by documents everyone in that room had the right to review. One by one, neighbors began speaking up. Carlos described receiving citations that mysteriously disappeared after he challenged them. Bill explained how he'd spent thousands complying with rules that never officially existed. Mrs. Donnelly admitted she'd been afraid to question Melissa because she didn't want to become the next target. The atmosphere changed in a way I don't think Melissa expected. People weren't angry because they'd been fined. They were angry because they'd been made to feel powerless. One board member quietly asked for a recess. Another requested an independent audit before any further votes could take place. The HOA attorney, who had remained silent most of the evening, finally leaned toward Melissa and whispered something I couldn't hear. Whatever it was drained every bit of confidence from her face. Within 15 minutes, the board voted to suspend her authority pending an outside investigation into governance procedures and financial oversight. Nobody cheered. Real life rarely works that way. People simply sat there absorbing the fact that the person they'd assumed was untouchable had just lost control in a single evening. As everyone slowly filtered out of the clubhouse, Melissa stopped beside me near the exit. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she quietly asked, "So this was your revenge?" I looked out across the parking lot where neighbors who had barely spoken to each other for months were now standing together in small groups, talking openly for the first time. "No," I answered. "If I wanted revenge, I would have stopped with the sprinklers." "This was accountability." She didn't respond. She simply walked away. Over the next several months, the neighborhood felt different. The new board adopted transparent voting procedures, published financial reports online, and removed several enforcement policies that had been used far too aggressively. People actually attended meetings because they believed their voices mattered again. Carlos eventually joked that my lawn had probably done more for community reform than any election ever had. I laughed because there was at least a little truth in that. The sprinkler system still runs every morning, almost exactly the way it always has. The only noticeable difference is that nobody cuts across the grass anymore. They use the sidewalk, wave as they pass, and keep walking. Sometimes I'll catch someone glancing at the lawn with a small smile, remembering that ridiculous morning when a perfectly timed spray of water exposed a much bigger problem hiding underneath the surface. Looking back now, I don't think this story was ever about landscaping, HOA rules, or even one difficult neighbor. It was about what happens when small acts of disrespect are ignored until they grow into something that affects an entire community. Setting boundaries doesn't always require shouting louder than the other person. Sometimes it just requires patience, good records, and the willingness to let the truth speak for itself when the time finally comes. Now I'd love to hear what you think. If you had been in my position, would you have handled Melissa differently? Or do you think letting the consequences unfold exactly as they did was the right approach? Drop your opinion in the comments because stories like this always spark strong debates about where the line is between standing up for yourself and getting even. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who's dealt with a difficult HOA or an overbearing neighbor. And I'll see you in the next one.